Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into a topic that might seem like something out of the 1800s, but it's a horrifying reality for many women around the world. We're talking about the sale of brides. Over the next few minutes, we'll be taking a hard look at 10 countries where this archaic practice still exists, exploring the cultural and economic factors that contribute to it, and most importantly, discussing what can be done to stop it. Our first stop takes us to India, a country rich in culture and tradition, but also grappling with patriarchal norms. These norms have been passed down through generations, often dictating the roles and expectations of women in society. In certain regions, particularly in impoverished communities, often disguised as arranged marriages, remains a persistent problem. This practice is not just a relic of the past, but a harsh reality for many. It's often an open secret, fueled by a toxic and a belief that women are somehow less valuable than men. These factors create an environment where such practices can thrive. Families struggling to make ends meet might see marrying off their daughter a way to alleviate their economic burdens, a way to put food on the table or pay off debts. This transactional view of marriage reduces the sacred bond to a mere financial arrangement. The price wildly, depending on factors like age, beauty, and even virginity. These criteria dehumanize women, turning them into commodities. Women sold into marriage often face a lifetime of abuse, Their dreams and aspirations are often crushed under the weight of these oppressive practices. It's a vicious cycle that perpetuates poverty and inequality, trapping generations of women in a system designed to breaking this cycle requires a collective effort to challenge and change these deep-seated beliefs and practices. Our journey takes us next to Afghanistan, a country ravaged by decades of conflict and instability. The ongoing humanitarian crisis, coupled with widespread poverty and displacement, has created fertile ground for exploitation. Families desperate for any kind of financial security may feel pressured to sell their daughters into marriage, often to much older men, in exchange for money or goods. The Taliban's return to power has only exacerbated the situation. Their regressive ideology, which severely restricts women's rights and freedoms, has created an environment of fear and oppression, making it even more difficult for women to escape abusive marriages or seek help. It's a horrifying reality for countless Afghan women and girls. Our next stop is Pakistan, where the practice of wata sata or bride exchange is sadly still prevalent. This often involves the exchange of young girls, some as young as infants, to settle debts or maintain family honor. In some cases, girls are exchanged as compensation for a crime, a practice known as vani. This deeply entrenched system of barter and exchange strips women of their agency, reducing them to mere pawns in a patriarchal. The Pakistani government has made some efforts to outlaw these practices, but enforcement remains weak. Deep-rooted cultural norms continue to fuel this horrific trade in human lives. Chapter 4. Our journey now takes us to China, the world's most populous nation, where a different kind of bride market has emerged, fueled by a demographic crisis. China's decades-long one-child policy, combined with a traditional preference for sons, has created a severe gender imbalance, with millions more men than women. This surplus of men has created a demand for brides, a demand that's being met in part through trafficking and forced marriage. The Chinese government has acknowledged the problem and taken some steps to crack down on trafficking networks, but the sheer scale of the issue, coupled with corruption and weak law enforcement, makes it a difficult problem to tackle. Chapter 5. Our next stop takes us to Nigeria, where the practice of bride price, deeply ingrained in many cultures across the country, has, in some cases, morphed into a system of commodifying women. Traditionally, the bride price was intended as a symbolic gesture of appreciation to the bride's family for raising her. But in recent years, it's become increasingly commercialized, with families demanding exorbitant sums of money, livestock, and other goods in exchange for their daughters. This distorted version of bride price has created a situation where women are trapped in marriages they didn't choose, often facing pressure to endure abuse and mistreatment. Chapter 6. Our journey now takes us to South Sudan, a nation grappling with the aftermath of a brutal civil war, which has left deep scars on its land and people. Here, the practice of bride price has been exacerbated by conflict, poverty and displacement, creating a complex web of social issues. In a country where cattle represent wealth and status, they are not just animals, but symbols of prosperity and power. Young brides are often seen as commodities to be traded, their worth measured in livestock. The value of a girl is often quantified in cows, a practice that has deep cultural roots. Families devastated by war and displacement may see marrying off their daughters as their only means of survival, a desperate measure in desperate times. This can create a perverse incentive for families to marry off their daughters at younger ages, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and inequality, fueling child marriage and robbing girls of their education and futures. It is a tragic reality for many. It's a tragic illustration of how conflict and instability can exacerbate existing gender inequalities, turning dreams into nightmares. Women and girls become victims of violence and exploitation, their lives forever altered by the scars of conflict. Our next stop takes us to Ethiopia, where the practice of bride price, known as tilak, is deeply ingrained in many communities. In rural communities, where poverty is widespread and access to education is limited, families may see marrying off their daughters as the only viable economic option. The bride price, often paid in the form of livestock, money, or other goods, can provide much-needed income or resources. However, this practice can also reduce women to commodities, their worth measured in material possessions. Girls may be pressured to marry older men or men they don't know simply because their families need the money. Chapter 8. Yemen, trapped by conflict and tradition. Our journey now takes us to Yemen, a country ravaged by years of civil war and humanitarian crisis, where the practice of bride price has taken on a particularly disturbing dimension. In a country where nearly 20 million people are food insecure and the economy has collapsed, families are resorting to desperate measures to survive. Marrying off their daughters, even at very young ages, has become a way to cope with crushing poverty, secure basic necessities, or even pay off debts. Armed groups and militias often exploit the vulnerability of displaced families, forcing them to hand over their daughters for marriage in exchange for protection or resources. It's a heartbreaking reality for countless families in Yemen. Chapter 9. Somalia, a culture of silence. Our penultimate stop takes us to Somalia, a country grappling with decades of conflict, poverty and instability, where the practice of bride price is deeply entrenched in the social fabric. This practice, while rooted in tradition, has far-reaching implications for the lives of Somali women. In Somali culture, the bride price, known as yarad, is traditionally paid in the form of camels, goats, or other livestock. These animals are not just economic assets, but also carry significant cultural value. While it's often seen as a cultural practice that honors the bride and her family, the reality is that it can trap women in a cycle of abuse and subjugation. The societal expectations and pressures can be overwhelming. The amount of yara demanded can vary widely depending on factors like the bride's family status, her level of education, and even her perceived beauty. This negotiation process can be lengthy and complex. This creates a system where women are essentially commodities, their value measured in livestock. The emotional and psychological toll on women can be profound, affecting their sense of self-worth and autonomy. Chapter 10. Bangladesh, Poverty's Grip. Our final stop takes us to Bangladesh, one of the most densely populated countries in the world, where poverty, lack of education, and deeply ingrained patriarchal norms create a fertile ground for the sale of brides. In rural communities where families often struggle to make ends meet, marrying off a daughter can seem like a financial lifeline. The bride price, often paid in cash or kind, can help alleviate poverty, pay off debts, or simply put food on the table. However, this practice comes at a steep human cost. Girls as young as 12 or 13 are being sold into marriage, often to much older men, robbing them of their childhoods, their education, and their futures. Well, folks, that was a lot to process. We've traveled to 10 countries, each with its own unique context, but all grappling with the same horrific practice, the sale of brides. It's a global crisis that demands our attention, our outrage, and our action. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Let's work together to raise awareness and put an end to these heartbreaking practices.